Hey, everybody, welcome to Ideas On. Today, we're going to talk about something near and dear to every storyteller in the world, of course, stealing things. Storytellers as thieves, because, well, you'll hear, but probably they are. Just a quick intro: Duncan Kennedy,
Hello.
Jared Wells,
Greetings.
and Olivia Allen.
Hi.
I'm Bob, and with us today is good friend, longtime Ideas collaborator, and story master Rick Stone. Rick is the proprietor of the storyintelligence.com website. He's written a wonderful new book called Story Intelligence about the seven powers of story. And he's the host of the Explorations podcast. We're great to have you with us, Rick.
Great to be here, Bob.
So, as we usually do, a real quick speed round. Let's figure out where we all came at this. Jared, where'd you go on this one?
So I sort of took the stance that I think to consider storytellers thieves, or at least to use so harsh a word, is a rather absurd thing, because the point of story as in the history of humanity is to package information and experiences from times immemorial down to today. It's the reason we've been able to survive, the reason we've been able to grow. So I think stealing, if you want to call it that, is an important part of storytelling, and one that everyone should practice if they are indeed a storyteller.
Okay, mandatory stealing. Olivia, where'd you go?
I talked about a few things. First of all, basically everything is taken from somewhere observational, um, things in life you pick up, you put it in a story. But I'm also interested in the ethics of that, and what we may or may not should take and put in our stories. I also talked about my hot take in that I think the whole all the stories I've been told thing is hot nonsense, and everyone on this panel is going to disagree with me. I am super ready to fight you. Uh,
I love it. Love it. But you do bring up a good point, which I hope we can explore a little more. Is we live in the age of the fungible content, right? It's not like when Gutenberg first rolled it out, it was pretty. Your work was pretty protected. So Duncan, how about you?
I took a different tact looking at what was actually being stolen. So, the first one, obviously, that storytellers being thieves in terms of whether intentionally or not, taking from stories that they had heard or they are familiar when they were crafting their own. The second was the notion of stealing reality because of the control the storyteller has, whether you're back to the town crier and how they would interpret the news to share with the village, or today's partisan battles over truth and reality and what is fact. And then the third notion was storytellers stealing our imaginations, and that is through the cultural power of successful stories. In that, courtesy of George Lucas, when we think of outer space, or Gene Roddenberry, or maybe Isaac Asimov, if we go back that far, outside of those three, it's pretty hard to come up with an original idea about space travel from a fictional standpoint, just because their broad story universes are so strong and impactful and widespread. It's hard to get away from them, and they control a lot of our initial reaction.
Cool. And I kind of went up in betwixt and between. I definitely fall on the side of, what do you mean stealing? Nobody owns this stuff. This is possessed by the species, and it comes out in flavors, and it's very hard, at least speaking from my own efforts. A lot of times it's hard to know, is that something I read or heard from another teller, or is it something that I synthesized, but the germination of it or the flow of it came from somewhere else. But that's kind of where I went. Rick, help us
Well,
make sense of out of all this. How does this all work?
there's a great story about Anansi the spider. And, Anansi goes up his ladder to Niami, the sky god, because the people are bored. And he hears that he has this something very special beside him. It's a box of thing called stories. He didn't even know what it was, but he heard it was very, very valuable. And so he has to perform some very heroic things to be able to earn the right to have the stories. And then he brings the stories down to the people. So I think the stories are actually, we don't steal them from each other. We maybe are given them by the gods. And I think that they come down. Jung talked about archetypes, and that where sometimes the same idea shows up in four different places in the earth at the same time. How is that possible? Why does that happen? And I think that these stories are out there. And Niami, when he opened that box of stories, they all went flying out and into the atmosphere. But he grabbed a couple, and his wife also grabbed a few, and his friends grabbed a few. But we're still grabbing those stories out of the sky and out of thin air and sharing them with our friends. So I think of storytellers as gifters, not thieves, as that we're gifting people the stories that are told through us.
Sure.
And that this notion that we're an author that's a very egoic kind of idea that we think, it's my story, I created this story. Well, the story created itself, and you just happen to be the spokesperson for it. So I think it's the wrong question, maybe, but
Sure. Well, so you saying that reminded me, and I like to tell, this is a meta story, right? It's a story about storytelling. So I learned to tell Rory from you, from listening to you do it, and it wasn't that you sat down and drilled me on it. I just learned it as storytellers do from the culture of being around. So I went along several years, and I would tell it and figuring, I kind of have this right. And then I heard you tell it again, and I realized about 35% of it, the way I told it, had nothing to do with the way you. I left stuff out that you had in it. I had added a bunch of stuff you never put in it. It's like, that's sort of the organics of how this stuff works. You mentioned the Jungian archetypes, and I, of course, also for this particular blog, I went back and took a quick look at Campbell, and his seven archetypes. Just the notion, though, of archetypes or character archetypes already says, stealing what? These are basic molecular ingredients in storytelling. Nobody owns hero, nobody owns mentor, nobody owns, an alchemist. I mean, those are big concepts. So yeah, I tend to think storytelling is maybe all art, really, but story for sure is very, very syncretic. We all grab stuff and run with it.
Yeah, but I think all art is. If you're a painter, an artist, when I was at the Art Institute in Chicago, they would send me to go sit in front of a Matisse or Picasso and draw and copy it. Okay, and why copy a master's work? And usually there was, Matisse, some of his drawings were very simple, just maybe 4 or 5 lines, and he captured a female body, and it was beautiful, but it was so perfect. And so by following the lines of what someone else did, you can learn something. You can get inside of their skin, and I think stories are no different. And so it's a great tip of the hat, I think, to other artists when we mimic them.
It's much like music. We're talking about these elements of story that are all around, and that people could just glom onto and utilize as they need to, because they're part of the ether of existence, in the same way that choosing a key or time signature is always out there for you to grab and create something melodious.
Yeah, I heard Paul McCartney recently on an interview, and he was talking about like Blackbird Sings in the Dead of Night. He just woke up with it. And he said for 2 weeks, he thought that probably it was somebody else's song. He wasn't sure. You hear so much music. He was sure that, and finally he started playing it for friends. He said, no, I've never heard anybody play that song before. But he wasn't sure, because, when you swim in it, if you're swimming in music or you're swimming in stories, they're all, they're doing this. And you don't know whether you've got something that's original, or whether maybe I borrowed that from somebody else. I don't know.
Yeah.
So all of this really begs the question to me, where did the notion that we are thieves exactly come from? Who was it that cast that negative attribute of is it just the fact that story at one point it was an important function of just communication, and then at another point it became something that was productized, that you could buy, that people were selling, that it became something you make money with?
What happened was we were coming up with topics for our podcasts, and I said, storytellers as thieves, that's a convenient phrase, and that's how we got that.
Well, I thought you meant, though, in the macro senses. Where did the notion
not necessarily this topic per se, just because that's a very pervasive notion that storytellers are thieves. I'm just curious, where did that start in history? And I wonder if in a world dominated by intellectual property, competing intellectual properties, if that has aggravated that sentiment more.
Well, and I think that kind of speaks to one of the places Olivia wanted to go, which was what are the ethics around that in a world where there's two things going on that may be pushing in opposite directions. One is, in the world of the thing euphemistically now known as the content creator, whatever that means,
The person
almost anything is an intellectual property. On the other side, in the age of the internet, almost anything is gettable. You can grab it, you can go find it and grab it.
But
Yeah.
I think we have to keep in mind that like there are always people on the other side of the thing on the internet, um, people who exist out there. So you can't just pretend that everything is to be taken as it is.
Mhm.
Like archetypes are beautiful things and they're templates, but um you can't just go take someone's creation for your own. That's why you can't just take a picture and put it in your own work, um, if it's copyrighted, because that's probably someone's art.
I want you to tell the story because we've laughed about it offline. Tell the story about self-plagiarism.
Okay. So I go to college as one does, and there's a weird thing that I still don't actually understand, but exists, where let's say I'm writing a paper like the fool English major that I am, and I wrote another paper in the past. If I'm going to like use a piece from that other paper in this paper and they're on basically the same topic, first of all, I need to quote myself. Um,
Why?
because honor code. I don't know what colleges do. It's just what they say. And I might have it a little bit wrong because of how confusing it is, because of how preposterous it is. But I had it explained to me one time about why they do it, and it kind of made sense. But then I forgot why, so it must have only made a little bit of sense.
But I think that goes back to Duncan's point and Rick's point about McCartney. Is that my lick or and music, I can't paint, but I can tell you music, most players, if they're honest, will tell you, I don't know where that lick came from. I've been playing it that way. I probably got it by listening to somebody or consciously got it. I mean, I have about a half a dozen guitar moves, and it goes back to the Rory story, right? I learned them intentionally saying, I want to play that exactly like Steve Gillette. I want to play that exactly like Dylan. I want to play that exactly like Steve Stills.
Well, where are
And
the
you learn and
boundaries?
learn and learn, and then you probably don't ever get there, but it's their lick. In my mind, that's Steve Stills' lick.
So where are the boundaries of this ownership? So one of the things I referenced was at the International Storytelling Festival in Jonesboro, Arkansas, and
Tennessee.
Storyteller. Sorry, Jonesboro, Tennessee. Thank you. Wrong Jonesboro. Anyways, and so storyteller emeritus Jay O'Callahan's telling his story Saturday afternoon, and the train comes through town, right, rattling right behind the stage, the way they have it set up there, and with a large tent. And he weaves the train into the story, so it's this visceral experience. The people had heard the story before, but they'd never heard it that way because the train was there, and you can't ignore it. You can't pause, So he just weaves it into the story. Does that mean you can't weave a train into a story when one's running behind the train tracks if you're telling a story? Does he own that? I mean,
If
he
the
owned that
train
moment that people talk about, but where's the boundaries of the thievery to happen if somebody else uses a train in the background as a story element?
No one owns the existence of a train. What I mean is, if you were to take J.K. Rowling's writing and write the Hogwarts Express into your story, unless you're writing fan fiction, then that's questionable ethics.
Oh,
Okay, but let's talk about fan fiction because I
Fan
think
fiction is great.
that's a whole other thing, right?
Yeah.
And I will argue probably been around in some form for a long time, but relatively new because it's easy to do now because we have these platforms to disseminate it. What is that some form of misappropriation?
I think that's just an entirely different genre, and some authors I don't love it, but some of them are like super cool with it. I know I would be, um, because it's creativity in that you're taking someone's established work and um just basically playing around with it. It's probably a controversial take in some circles, but I think it's great.
Isn't fan fiction, at least I'm not into the world all that much, but I mean, I've always thought of it as not too terribly different from the tradition of storytelling in itself, because storytelling is just in a way it's the summary intellect of the entire human experience throughout time is what I consider it to be. It's where all of the knowledge that we have is stored, all the lessons that we have, everything we know about ourselves and the universe around us is stored in this thing called storytelling. And I always thought of fan fiction as it's just sort of that on a micro scale. It's a world that is established, but it's still just building. It's still just building on the world. It's still just taking new experiences and adding them into that brain of whatever that world is.
But Rick, isn't something like the Anansi stories, or something like the stories that our pal Larry Littlebird tells about coyote or bear
Right.
or wolf, isn't that really fan fiction? I got to believe those
Yeah.
were built on over time.
Yeah, and just think of the Silk Road. Okay, what happened for hundreds of thousands of years as people traveled, merchants traveled. They brought their stories with them, and they're sitting at the inn or around at the oasis or whatever. They're meeting people from other parts of the world, and they're telling their stories, and they're taking they're taking the Rory story or whatever the story is, and people transpose it into their cultural milieu, and you suddenly look around and you start looking at folk literature, and you find the same story showing up all over the place. They've got a different character name, but essentially it's the same story. And I think with fan fiction, that's what people are doing today. Is they're just building off of a story they read instead of heard. Okay, so this is an interesting question when you get into intellectual property. It's in a book, it's been written, and someone has a copyright, a big C with a circle on it, and they own it. But when oral culture, which was pretty much dominant in this world up until just a few hundred years ago, really last couple hundred years, you know, there wasn't a copy. Someone didn't say, "Hey, no, I'm going to tell you a story, but I own this story. You can't repeat it anywhere." People didn't do that. They gave the story away, and people took the story and they ran with it, and they told it again, and they told it again, and it changed and transmuted, but and it became a little something else. Isn't that what people are doing with fan fiction?
Well, don't you think it's a little bit different so if you take characters and the world from someone's established piece and basically write another story that exists with those exact characters and within that exact world, instead of see it as compared to what I get from it is you're comparing to um, seeing different instances of similar folkloric characters in different places around the world, which by the way I'm fascinated by. I'm really into mythology and folklore, so like I don't know, for example, multiple cultures having the concept of seal women or mermaids or whatever. Um, to me, that's a lot different than I don't know, Marvel fan fiction.
Yeah, but fan fiction comes from a void. You
Does
think
it
that?
though?
Yes, it does. Think about Star Trek. Think about Star Wars. Star Wars came out, and this immense universe was created. And for the first, I don't know, 15 years, maybe there was only 3 movies. And fans had a thirst. They wanted to live in that reality. And George Lucas was
Oh, you
lazy
mean
and
it
busy
comes
with
to
other
fill a
stuff. And
void?
so there was
Yeah.
only 3 movies, but I wanted to know more about these characters and these huge,
Yeah.
story arcs for Luke and Darth and Leia and everything. And sure, Lucas got around to doing that, but you had impatient fans who wanted to speculate what would happen and live in that universe. Same thing with Star Trek. Yeah, there were 72 episodes, but that was only over the course of 3 years. But it created this wagon train in space, as Gene Roddenberry pitched it, in terms of there's this story arc in this universe with this wealth of characters that people who loved that felt wanted to live in and experience more than just what the original author had created. So there's an homage to it as long as you're respectful to it. And if they're not generating any money from it, it's purely based on their fan fiction and not trying to make some scratch out of it. It's
Okay, so
I
that's
think
the
nothing wrong
thing.
with it.
It would probably not be the move to publish a piece of fan fiction. think most people who write fan fiction would agree with that, unless you change the names and publish 50 Shades of Grey. But then people publish plenty of books of different mythologies, which seem to all build on each other. So
so the answer to when does it become
that's
a
fine. That seems fine to me. So it just feels like if it's someone's exact characters, that's not what you should do.
Well, and I think you bring up something really, that last sentence is really interesting. It's not what you should do. Set aside whether it's legal or not, right? It's not nice. I mean,
No,
there is a
it's
point where you
not.
say, "Hey, Rick, that story you wrote and published in your book that I know was a work of original authorship, I really love it. Can I borrow that talking frog character? Because I just love him. I'm going to change his name. Is that? I mean, and I don't know where the various shades of gray on that are. Right? There are all kinds of nuances. It seems to me one of the answers to, well, if storytellers are thieves, how come that is thought of? To me, it started when you could charge for your story. I mean,
That's where my, yeah.
as soon as you can charge for your story, or by the way, your song or your poem or your picture, right? The people who did the cave paintings in France of the water buffalo, they didn't get, there were no royalties on that.
Oh no, they were you had to pay for admission to get into the cave.
Yeah, well, you really did, because it was
It was usually like like a piece of mutton or something.
it was a kilometer walk in the dark just to get where it was. But
That's the payment.
I think we've kind of established where, it's funny. There's an old adage about advertising that until the early 1900s, particularly in the United States, it was thought of as a kind of a social gaffe if you went out and bought a new pair of boots, right? Well, what did he buy a new pair of boots? Those boots were just, you could have mended those boots. What's wrong with him? Then advertising happened, and all of a sudden,
Absolutely.
we decided culturally, no, you need a new pair of boots. You need to smell better. You need, so it's funny how cultures, wrap around this stuff.
Okay. But I'm not going to argue that multiple shoes are cool, because they are. But like, but that's not the topic at hand. The topic at hand is that there's a difference between boots and stories. Although boots could be a story, and probably are. You can mend your boots and have them fulfill the same function as they were before. You cannot have one story instead of two stories and have it fulfilling the same function, because that is not the same story.
No, that's true.
So it's it's an interesting question here. You think about music, and sometimes when you hear where people go to court because they feel like their song was stolen, at what point does a song that was my song, how much, what's been changed over here? At one point, does it original? Did you take a couple chords? That's okay? But there's some line, and I don't know how they end up. But at some point, you go, that sounds too much like like his song, and you've appropriated his song.
Well, and the courts have weighed in on that, right? I wrote this in my blog. In music, it's a known practice. You take a tune you like, you do an inversion, you change the key, and you slow it down, and that's fair game. You could get away with that. Here's what you talk about. What sharpens my pencil. When I'm emperor, sampling is going to be punishable by banishment, because I just think sampling is wrong unless it's a
What
pure.
do you mean sampling?
Unless it's a pure tone, that's my lick. You don't get to just record it and reuse it without talking to me.
What does sampling mean?
That's the way it works. They notify the artist that they're going to be using the sample. They pay them the royalty rights for using it because it's an established piece of music, and you cash your check and enjoy living on the beach while somebody else is doing something different.
And if they do that, I think that's
Someone told me what sampling is. What is sampling?
If I record, let's say I record a record, and there's a little 5-note run of melody in it, with some instrumentation under it. Sampling is when somebody literally records that 5-note run exactly as I recorded it and uses it to mix into their new piece of music that they're creating. Well,
I think if you have the original creator's permission, very cool.
Permission, yes, but that's my point.
But I think
the original creator's permission.
But the analogy is similar.
Not a kind move.
Yeah, sampling
should stop.
characters or sampling a storyline, is that's what you're saying. Is someone goes to Rawlings' work and and lives Hogwarts and lists all the main characters and builds a new story around it, they're in a sense sampling. And so we can get into it.
And
I'm
if
sure
they don't publish that, that's or like if they don't.
it's so, yeah, what what you do in the privacy of your own home or with your friends, who cares? If I'm not making money from it, I can do anything I want.
So
That's
that
the difference
leads to
between
another
permission and compensation.
Is money the culprit?
Yeah, that leads to another question for me. The other side is, when does something that began potentially as an original work finally migrate its way into the common domain, right? I'll give you an example. And I mean, the concept of orcs and elves and dwarves, the way Tolkien characterized them, that's commonly used now, and that language is commonly used across people who write fantasy.
Tolkien didn't make that up.
I got
Tolkien
it.
didn't make that up.
You got it.
That from mythologies.
Somebody did. So my point is, people.
Yeah,
do make
so
stuff-
we can't say that it was Tolkien who originated that.
I didn't.
Tolkien used it,
I didn't.
and other people use it.
I didn't say it was. I said someone originated it, but by the time Tolkien came along, and lots and lots and lots of other writers, those things were already absorbed into the common pool of story assets, and it'd be fun to figure out what that process is. I guess
Ask Paul McCartney.
Yeah,
Ask Paul McCartney. He owns the licensing rights to Happy Birthday.
Yeah.
right. He does. Yeah, and Disney did not own
smart businessman.
Dot, which is really interesting. That's another one. You don't have to always own it. Sometimes a story or a character or a piece of music is so highly identified with someone who was a licensed user of it that they de facto become the perceived owner of it. So it's just fun.
George Carlin in the 7 words you can't say on TV.
Absolutely.
Which I could quote but won't.
Yes.
Sort of
Wait, what is on TV?
well, look,
Explicit content label to talk about that.
one thing
Do
is
that offline.
in the
You're
grand
too young for this. Much too young for this, Olivia.
I hate that sentence. And Peter's gonna die.
in the grand tradition of storytellers, we have managed to do what storytellers always do, which is between 5 storytellers, we've got 241 opinions, which is, of course, what makes the whole tradition wonderful. So I think that was a great flog. Where we agree is that there's lots of folks borrowing and swapping and sharing and tweaking and customizing. And I think, to Olivia's point about ethics, I do think there's an ethical responsibility, even among writers and artists. And as Mark Twain said, as I put in my blog, burglars, congressmen, all of us in the trade, that there is an ethical threshold. And at the end of the day, probably everybody's better served if we all just voluntarily sort of think about that as we go forward. Well, Rick, thanks for coming back to the tribe today to sit in. It's great to see you.
It feels like old home weight to me.
Well, it
Look
is.
forward to getting your book. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Go to Amazon.
Yeah.
Comes out in 3 weeks. Three
All right.
weeks.
So we can get that on Amazon and regular places we get books?
Yeah, it'll be available on Amazon, and if there are no other regular places to get books anymore, unfortunately.
There are. I go to them.
But we
Hey,
still have
for
Barnes
our,
and Noble in my neighborhood, so
For our listeners and viewers, can you say the title of the book one more time?
Yeah, so the title of the book is Story Intelligence.
Story Intelligence.
By myself and my partner, Scott Livengood. And it's called Story Intelligence, Mastering Story, Mastering Life. And it really looks at the power of story. We talk about 7 powers of story, and it tries to look at his stories intersect with every dimension of humanity, and that it's really fundamental to who we are as human beings.
well, and as I like to say too, when I talk to people about storytelling, it's the way a relatively defenseless animal with no teeth, claws, and the inability to run fast, whose young take years to be on their own. It's how we took over a planet. So whatever storytelling is, we probably all ought to understand it, because
We shouldn't have. We're ruining the place.
Yeah, well, and by the way, there's a lovely little piece where I interview Bob about ideas and ideas work. That's in the last chapter. So
yeah, I hope I didn't have all my good stuff on the cutting room floor. We'll see. So
I think there's 4 words left from the interview.
Clean up.
Well, I hope one of them.
Story, therefore I am.
I hope
That's
one of
what
them
it
is
is.
bulbous, because bulbous is one of my favorite words. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you guys today, and thanks for tuning in. And just remember, check us out online at Ideas On. We're on YouTube. We are available for your listening pleasure wherever you get your podcasts. And absolutely go check out our blog online at ideasorlando.com. Thanks a lot. See you soon.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Bye.
Bob.
See ya.
See ya.
Clear. Okay, good.
Still recording.